Good boys. Original M1, 1942, 1943. Beautiful. 30-06. Are you ready for this? Are you ready for this? Listen.
Beautiful indeed. Many recognize the M1 Garand as one of the finest service rifles of all time. General George Patton was of the opinion that it was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Now, at the close of World War I in 1918, the United States military wanted a semi-auto service rifle. It was during this time where semi-automatic rifles were not in use in the military, even though they did have their 1911s as sidearms. So for the next 13 years, many different designs were offered up, but they were all turned down either because the rifle was too big or too heavy to operate and carry, or it fired too small of a caliber. One of these people who submitted a design was Canadian-born John Garand, who's working for Springfield Arms. And he did have a promising design, but it did end up falling through. But 13 years later, he offered the first prototype M1. 5 years later, in 1936, the M1 Garand was adopted into the United States Army, but it still had some issues. All of them were eliminated the following year in 1937. So finally, in 1938, the M1 Garand was officially adopted and issued as a service rifle, and it had replaced the Springfield M1903 .30 caliber bolt action rifle. 2 years later, in 1940, the Marine Corps and the Navy had adopted the M1 Garand, and it was also in the same year that there was growing tensions in Japan and Europe. So a second company was contracted into making more M1 Garands. This company was Winchester. And then the attack on Pearl Harbor had really triggered the prioritizing of manufacturing the M1 Garand and distributing them to the American military. And from this time up until 1945, so the closing of World War II, over 4 million of these rifles were made and used in the military. And because the United States military was the only military who was offered a semi-automatic as their standard service rifle, there was an awful lot of superior firepower. Now, at the end of World War II, production of the M1 Garand was finished, and all the remaining M1 Garands were either collected and put away in storage, or they were loaned out to other countries. But in 1950, when the United States was once again at war, this time with Korea, the M1 Garand was reinstated into service, and this time, along with Springfield Arms, 2 other companies were contracted into manufacturing more M1s. And one of these companies was Harrington and Richardson Arms, and I do not remember what the second company was. So this time, almost 1.5 million new M1s were manufactured and distributed in the American military. And the M1 Garand remained the United States service rifle until it was replaced by the M14 in 1957 or 1958. I'm not sure which year for sure. But the M14 was a little lighter. It had a little less recoil since it fired the .308 Winchester, and it also had a detachable magazine, unlike the M1 Garand. And this magazine could hold, I believe, 30 rounds as opposed to the M1 Garand's 8-round capacity. And on top of that, the M14 could very simply be switched from semi-automatic fire to fully automatic fire. Now, even though the American military was no longer using the M1 Garand, other countries still were, and they used them well into the Vietnam era. And even though the M1 Garand has been retired from use in the military, it is still highly revered and enjoyed by avid gun collectors and shooters to this very day.